Yeah, that's a great backdrop, Gautam. So maybe we can start with a grounded conversation. Um, see, this whole term concept around agentic systems is becoming more and more visible and more discussed within the business organizations, and rightfully so. But it also has a bit of mixed interpretation, right? So when you talk to business leaders and IT leaders and try to explain what an agentic system is, how do you approach and explain that in a much more simplistic and practical way?
Um, sure. I think, um, so look, in the most, simplistic way, if you have to define, and if you look at the journey that has exponentially grown over the last about 2.5 to 3 years in the AI space. Look, AI has been there for quite a bit of time, but it's only, I think, gotten off just in the last about 2.5 3 years. After the large language models, became much more accessible to everyone at a cost that's actually not accessible to everyone, and so on, right? So, which is where that capability was actually available now, and it's getting more and more important today because there are a lot of organizations, almost now 80%, in the last 2 years, if you see, organizations that have now using these new AI models in one way or the other. And that's and that has grown from almost, I think, where it was about 25-30% about 2.5 years ago, to almost
Mm.
80% plus now, in Q1 of 2026. But all of that, right, I think the just shows that, look, the adoption of this fundamentally changing technology has been extremely high, and the curve is very, very steep, as compared to any previous changes that we have seen. So what is it that's making this different, to answer your question, right? um, so in most simplistic terms, right, so agents are systems that are able to do either of these four things, right? One, are they able to actually perceive what's happening in their environment, right? So either in terms of the data that they're being fed, or events that are happening, or visuals that are getting presented to them, or whatever that they're hearing, right? So that's where essentially our AI agents that can actually perceive the environment. The second type of agents essentially more around reasoning, where the agents are able to not just understand what they are perceiving, but able to actually make a judgment call on what to do with that particular perception that they have gathered. Um, the third is essentially, now that they've actually perceived, they have actually reasoned, understood, what to do. They have now the capability to actually act, right? So they can actually act through tools, through APIs, through other systems, and take that action. And not just actually stop there, but also then adapt further, learn from what the outcome has been, and then get into a loop where they actually perceive, reason, act, adapt, and it can go on into a continuous loop, right? So in the most simplistic terms, AI agents are systems that are actually built with underlying large language model intelligence, if I were to put it in very very kind of layman terms,
Mm.
that are very highly intelligent, that are able to have a logic which is following neural logic, which is like the way that our brain works, and able to perceive, reason, act, and adapt, right?
Mm.
So if you were to really look at it, that, look, the automation till now that we knew, the automation till before these new agentic AIs or AI agents, was something that automation executed. Now the agents are the ones that are able to decide for themselves, right? So that's where the autonomy comes in.
Yeah, yeah. And you already differentiated, explained well as to how it differs from the traditional automation, because automation as a concept is not new. We had different ways of automations, and this is a bit different. But just to clarify a few points for our audience, how would you differentiate agents from, let's say, microservices and other automation technologies in the past?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think a bit technical in nature as well, depending on the audience and who would look at it, right? But essentially, if you're looking at how are today's AI agents or Gen AI or agentic AI different, fundamentally different from automations or workflows or microservices, all of the systems that we know of today. Um, it would be easier to understand it from their behavior in terms of how different their behavior is from the traditional, or not, no, I shouldn't say traditional, whatever that we know of automation, workflow, microservices before the new AI foray
Mm,
to now into the agentic systems, right? How are they different? And if I were to really kind of simplify it, maybe I would actually put it in five different dimensions. Um, so the first dimension essentially is the execution path of how that particular system is executing whatever it's supposed to do. Right. And in this case, right, so the traditional automation of workflow or microservices, they would typically have predefined, deterministic paths, right? So you have defined or programmed it in such a way that it will behave in a particular manner, and you will be fairly certain that looking that's how you have programmed it. An agentic system is something that the execution path that it actually follows is more emerging, based on the context that it is provided and planned at the runtime, right? So it will decide in terms of what and how I should behave, while it's actually being executed itself. So one, that execution path is, fundamentally different. The second part, if you look at it for any system, is where do you think that the system can fail, right? So from a failure mode perspective, typical traditional automation workflows, microservices, they would the failure mode would be typically, from a predictable standpoint, right? So where either it would time out, that look, there is no response from it, or there would be an exception, a scenario that it has not come across, and that's the reason why it will terminate, right? So in which case that particular transaction or an action or execution that automation is supposed to provide, it will fail and stop, and it stop at a particular point. Whereas if you look at agentic system, then the failure mode for an agentic system typically is it's a bit more probabilistic. So it might still continue to operate, right? But it would actually either hallucinate, it will actually create stories, right? Or it would drift, from the level of confidence that it's supposed to provide. What's the exact required output, right? Because there is a inherent intelligent judgmental system that's actually running behind it. So that probabilistic behavior around failure being from hallucination and drift is different uh, with respect to traditional automation systems, which is more timeout or exception based. The third is essentially around testing, right? So how would you test a typical automation system versus how would we typically test today an agentic system, right? Very we've been now for past so many years, right? Been used to do your unit test, system test, integration test for whenever these systems are getting developed, right? Your automation workflows, some microservices, APIs, etc. For agentic system, however, I think the testing needs to be a more about evaluation. That look, what's the level of confidence of the output that is getting produced? What's the level of accuracy that it is actually getting produced, right? You'll have to constantly simulate to understand, whether the system is drifting or not drifting. You'll have to do behavioral testing in terms of those AI agents in different scenarios. How are they behaving? Because there is no, standard input, standard output, kind of scenarios, right? Because the behavior of the system would depend on what's the context you're providing at the input, and based on that, even then, the output would be typically different into different scenarios, right? So the testing is different. Um, the fourth is essentially where it comes with the state that the systems follow, right? So whether traditional IT systems, they're either stateless or session bound, in terms of having a particular state, with a particular, set parameters that are there relevant at that point in time. Okay. But however, agentic systems, they have a memory that actually goes, across a time horizon, right? So in terms of how do you track that, that's also a state in terms of that it has a memory of its own, and it could work either ways, right? I mean, sometimes, in most times, it gives the context, but in certain times, if you want it to behave certainly differently, then you would need to ask it to forget what the previous memory was to be able to really get the required output that you need. And the last fifth is essentially about the governance, right? How would you govern agentic systems? Your code reviews, change management, typically are your governance mechanisms for traditional IT systems. Whereas in case of agentic systems, what you would need to do is, you need to continuously observe their behavior. You need to continuously evaluate the um, how that system has been built, how the underlying LLM models are actually being released on a frequent basis, and basis that, is the system kind of changing and so on. So you have to continuously evaluate both before production and after production as well, in terms of what's happening with that system.
Yeah.
So and so, very sorry, a long-winded answer, but I think if I were to summarize in a way, that typically, a microservice, would typically answer what exactly it is doing, right? What exactly we need to do. A typical workflow would actually help us to execute how essentially a particular process needs to run. Whereas the newer systems agents, in addition to the what and how, it actually gets a why as well, that it's able to reason and then decide in terms of, how the what and how have to be performed.